In the churchyard at Eccleston, a short walk from the gates of Eton Hall, stands a small stone memorial to a boy who died at 4 years old. His name was Edward, and he was the only son the richest man in Britain would ever make. His father owned the ground beneath half of Mayfair, a house with 54 bedrooms, and more land than most men could walk across in a week. But across the next half-century, he would marry 4 times, bury the boy, and never once produce another son to carry his name. And when he died at last, the dukedom he had spent his whole life trying to keep in his own blood passed sideways, to a cousin, as though the 4 weddings had never happened. The fortune found its heir. It simply refused to come from him. If you love the stories the polite histories leave in the footnotes, the ones about what all the money in England still could not buy, subscribe now, and the next one will find you. Chapter 1. The boy named after a horse. He was named after a racehorse, and he came into an empire of rent before he was old enough to understand what it meant. His name was Hugh Richard Arthur Grosvenor, though almost no one ever used it. From boyhood, he was Bendor, after Bendor, the chestnut colt his grandfather kept that won the Derby at Epsom in 1880, the year after the boy was born. The horse won its single golden afternoon. The name fixed itself to the child, and for the rest of his long life, kings and prime ministers, and every woman he married, would call him by the name of an animal that ran fast once. He was born on the 19th of March, 1879, into the very highest reach of the English aristocracy, and yet the great inheritance reached him by a crooked path, the way great inheritances sometimes do when death arrives out of its proper order. His father, Lord Henry Grosvenor, died before the dukedom could ever come to him, so the title skipped a generation. When the first Duke of Westminster died in December of 1899, the whole vast estate leapt clean over the dead father and landed on the 20-year-old grandson. Overnight, without effort or achievement of any kind, Bendor became the second Duke of Westminster and one of the richest human beings then alive. To measure what that meant, look at what came with the name. He inherited the entailed Grosvenor estates, more than 130,000 acres spread across Britain. He inherited the freehold of much of Mayfair and Belgravia, the most valuable ground in the country, streets where every house and shop and embassy paid the family for the privilege of standing there. He inherited Eton Hall in Cheshire, a country palace counted in dozens of bedrooms and set in thousands of acres of its own park. He was a young man, handed the keys to a kingdom of brick and rent, and he had done nothing to earn a single stone of it beyond being born to the right grandfather at the right hour. The Grosvenors had held that ground for centuries, and the family fortune had grown not by daring or invention, but by the slow accident of London swelling outward across land they happened to own. Where their ancestors had held fields and marsh on the western edge of the old city, the capital had spread and built and multiplied, until the family found itself holding the freehold of the grandest addresses in the kingdom, and drawing rent from them without lifting a hand. It was wealth of the oldest and safest kind, wealth that did not have to be won each morning, and by the time it descended to Bendor, it had compounded into a fortune with almost no equal in the country. He was, from the age of 20, a landlord to embassies and dukes and millionaires, the man who owned the floor beneath the feet of fashionable London. There is one word that has to be understood before any of the rest of this story makes sense, and that word is entail. The Grosvenor estate was entailed, which is to say it was bound by law to descend down a single male line from father to son to grandson, and it could not be freely given away or left as a man chose. A daughter could not inherit the dukedom. A daughter could not hold the great estate. Without a son of his own body, everything Bendor now owned, the rent and the acres and the houses and the paintings on their walls, would one day slide off his line entirely and pass to whatever male cousin stood next in the succession. The fortune, in other words, did not truly belong to him. He was a caretaker of it, and the rent of the estate was, in the cold language of the law, a debt owed to a son he had not yet made. That is the machine at the centre of this whole story, and it is worth being plain about how pitiless it was. An entail did not care whether a man loved his wife or hated her, whether he was happy or wretched, whether his daughters were clever and devoted or his cousins were strangers he had never met. It cared about one thing only, a male heir of the body, and it enforced that single demand with the full weight of English law. A man could own more of the country than almost anyone alive, and still, if he failed to produce a son, watch the whole inheritance prepare to step around him. For a young Duke of 20, freshly rich and endlessly indulged, this was an abstract clause in a dusty settlement, easy to leave to the future. It would not stay abstract. In time, it would become the single fact that governed the rest of his life. It is easy, at a distance of more than a century, to underrate how total that demand was. The great English estates did not pass to the ablest child, or the kindest, or the one who loved the land the most. They passed, under the old rule of primogeniture, to the eldest surviving son, and to no one else. And if there was no son at all, the whole edifice went to the nearest male relative in the line, however distant, however little known to the family. A duke was, in a sense, married to that rule long before he was ever married to a woman. His first duty, ahead of happiness, ahead of love, ahead of everything, was to make the boy who would keep the name and the ground together for one more generation. Bendor had been born into that duty as surely as he had been born into the rent, and for a long while he treated it as lightly as he treated everything else, because for a long while, like everything else, it seemed to be taking care of itself, and there was a very great deal to keep together. The Grosvenors were not a family whose fortune could be carried off in a strongbox or moved to another country in a bad year. It was land, fixed and enormous and scattered across Britain, and it came with an entire world attached to it, the tenants and the farms, the gardeners and grooms and gamekeepers, the small standing army of servants it took to keep a house of 54 bedrooms alive, the agents who gathered the London rents street by street. To be the Duke of Westminster was to sit at the head of something closer to a small principality than a private fortune. The entail existed precisely to make certain that principality was never broken up or scattered, but passed down whole, from one male heir to the next, intact through the generations. It was a magnificent machine for preserving wealth, and it had exactly one weakness, which was that it could not manufacture the heir it required. It could only wait for him. And when he did not come, it did not bend, or adapt, or make an exception for grief or wealth or good intentions. It simply reached past the man who had failed to produce him and found somebody else. For now, Bendor had every reason to believe the future would arrange itself as smoothly as everything else in his life had. He was tall and fair and physically fearless, charming in the careless way of men who have never once in their lives been told no. He went to war in South Africa against the Boers and won a decoration for it. And there, on the veldt, he first fell into the company of a young officer and correspondent named Winston Churchill, beginning a friendship that would run through everything that followed and last until Bendor's death. He would soldier again, and harder, in the Great War, and collect his honours and his titles, the letters after his name that marked a man of rank who had also served. In between, He hunted and raced and drove fast motor cars when a motor car was still a rich man's toy, and he moved through the world with the easy certainty of a man for whom the world had always made room. What he did not yet know, what no clause in any settlement could have taught him, was that the one thing his fortune most needed from him was the one thing his fortune could not simply command. It could buy him a house on any street he fancied. It could buy him horses and yachts and the good opinion of half of London. It could not buy him a living son. And the estate, patient and indifferent, would go on waiting for that son through 4 marriages and more than 40 years. And in the end, it would wait in vain and take its heir from somewhere else entirely. He grew up believing, as such men do, that wanting a thing and getting it were very nearly the same act. The rent taught him that. It arrived whether he rose early or lay abed, whether he was kind or cruel, clever or idle. It simply came, year upon year, a river with no source he had to tend. A boy raised beside that river learns a dangerous lesson, that the world is arranged for his comfort and will keep arranging itself so. Most of his life would prove the lesson true. The last, hardest part of it would prove the lesson a lie, and the proof would be a small grave in a Cheshire churchyard and a title carried off, at the end, to a man he had never meant to have it. But that reckoning lay decades ahead. First, the boy named after a horse had to become the man who believed the whole world was his to buy, and to do that, he had only to grow up rich, which he did, magnificently, and without the smallest suspicion that the ground beneath all that wealth had a crack running through it, shaped exactly like a cradle. Chapter 2. A fortune built on other people's rent. His money did not come from coal or cotton or conquest. It came from the oldest and quietest source of wealth in the world, owning the land that everyone else had to pay to stand upon. To feel the weight of what the second Duke of Westminster carried, and later the weight of what he failed to pass on, the size of the fortune has to be laid out plainly, because the size of it is not decoration in this story. It is the reason the missing son mattered so much. The Grosvenor estate in the heart of London was, and remains today, one of the most valuable pieces of private property anywhere on earth. Bendor held the ground beneath Belgravia, the cream-coloured terraces around Belgrave Square and Eaton Square, addresses so grand that to live there was itself a statement of rank. He held much of Mayfair, the streets between Hyde Park and Bond Street, where the embassies stood and the great hotels rose. He held broad stretches of Pimlico besides. The rent from that ground came in without labour, without risk, without a single hour of his attention. He owned the floor of the richest square mile in the country, and the world paid him for the use of it, day after day, decade upon decade, the sums swelling as London itself swelled around his holdings. The genius of that kind of wealth, if genius is the word, is that it needed nothing from the man who held it. A factory can burn down, a ship can sink, a business can be undone by a cleverer rival, or a bad season, or a shift in fashion. Ground rent, in the centre of London, did none of those things. It simply accrued, lease upon lease, tenant upon tenant, the great families and the embassies and the shopkeepers all paying, year after year, for the right to occupy land the Grosvenors had held since before any of them arrived. Bendor did not have to be shrewd to stay rich. He had to do nothing at all, and the fortune would keep him regardless. It is a strange soil to grow a character in, and it grew in him exactly the character one might expect, a man who assumed the world would provide. The scale of that provision is hard to hold in the mind, so it is worth gathering the numbers into one place. The freehold of much of Mayfair and Belgravia and Pimlico, more than 130,000 acres across Britain, a country palace of 54 bedrooms, 11,000 acres of park around it, a deer forest in the far north of Scotland, a great hunting estate in the south of France, 2 ocean-going yachts, one of them among the largest afloat in the world, old masters by Rembrandt and Goya and Velázquez and Rubens hung on the walls of a single house. Put beside the wage of a working man of the time, a few pounds a week if he was fortunate, the wealth becomes almost impossible to picture. A fortune so far beyond ordinary life that it operated by different laws entirely. Bendor never had to think about the cost of anything, and a man who never thinks about cost slowly loses the ability to think about limits at all. And the great house itself was a world in miniature, a machine that ran on people. Eaton Hall in its prime employed a small town's worth of servants, footmen and housemaids and cooks and grooms and keepers, each with a place and a rank in a hierarchy as strict as any regiment. The house had to be heated and lit and cleaned and fed, its horses exercised, its gardens kept, its great rooms made ready whether the Duke was in residence or 1,000 miles away on his yacht. All of it existed to serve one family and, at the very top of it, one man. And the whole elaborate structure had been built, over centuries, to be handed down from father to son. Take away the son, and the machine did not stop. It simply prepared, quietly, to be handed to someone else. Out in Cheshire sat the family's great seat, Eaton Hall, an enormous house so large it was reckoned in dozens of bedrooms, commonly counted at 54. Its walls carried old masters, canvases by Goya and Rubens and Rembrandt, by Velázquez and Raphael and Frans Hals, the sort of collection a national gallery might envy. Around the house lay some 11,000 acres of park and garden and stable. He kept a mansion called Grosvenor House on Park Lane in London as well, one of the grandest private residences in the capital. He kept the Ray Forest and Lochmore in the far north of Scotland, thousands of acres of deer country in Sutherland. He kept a chateau in France, near Rouen, and in the pine forests of the Landes between Bordeaux and Biarritz, the great hunting estate of Mimizan, where he chased wild boar with his friends across a vast sporting ground, and he kept yachts, 2 of them, with the same easy carelessness that other men keep a spare pair of shoes. One was the Cutty Sark, the other was the Flying Cloud, a black-hulled schooner of some 86 metres, among the largest private sailing vessels afloat in the world. A man does not buy 2 ocean-going yachts because he needs them. He buys them because the money has nowhere else to go, and because the buying of things has become the shape of his days. Those decks, between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, would in time carry the most famous romance of his life. But even empty, they told the same story as everything else he owned, that here was a man for whom scale had lost all meaning, who could summon anything and did. Set the inventory down all at once, and the scale of it stops the breath. A house of 54 bedrooms, 11,000 acres of park around it, more than 130,000 acres across Britain in all, the freehold of much of Mayfair and Belgravia and Pimlico, the costliest ground in the kingdom, a great mansion on Park Lane, a deer forest in Scotland, a chateau in Normandy, a great hunting estate in the south of France, 2 ocean-going yachts, old masters by 6 of the greatest painters who ever lived, hung casually on the walls of a country house. By almost every reckoning of the age, Hugh Grosvenor was the richest man in Britain and stood among the richest in the world. There was, quite literally, no comfort he could be told he could not afford. And a man raised inside a fortune of that size has no working knowledge of the word no. It is simply absent from his life, so it is absent from his character. When he wanted a house, he bought it. When he wanted a divorce, in time, He arranged and paid for it on a scale that made the newspapers. When he wanted a woman, the world had trained him to expect that she would come. He could be strikingly generous, and often was. On his Pimlico ground, he granted long leases to build homes for working families at rents so small they were almost a joke, £1 a year in one case, a shilling in another, so that hundreds of ordinary people had somewhere to live. Giving on that scale cost him nothing he could feel, because the rest of the river of rent kept flowing regardless. Generosity was easy. It asked nothing of him. The hard thing, the thing that costs a person something real, is to be refused and to bear it. And that lesson the rent never taught him, because the rent never refused him anything. Every want he had ever formed had been met almost before he finished forming it. He had never in his life been made to wait for a thing he desired, never been told that a door was closed to him, never once run up against a limit that money and rank could not dissolve. It made him charming in a way, the ease of a man who has never had to fight for anything. It also left him without the one muscle that ordinary life builds in everyone else, the muscle that lets a person survive being told no, and that missing muscle would matter enormously when the great refusals of his life finally came. Yet at the dead centre of all this abundance sat a single absence that no amount of money could fill. It was a son. The entail wanted an heir of his body, a boy to carry the name and hold the ground when he was gone, and for all the acres and all the rent and all the paintings on all the walls. The one thing the estate most required was the one thing he would spend his life failing to produce. Picture him young and gilded and certain, master of more of England than a man could ride across in a week, and notice the shape of the hollow at the middle of it. The fortune could make him comfortable beyond the dreams of ordinary men. It could not make him a father to a surviving son, and without that son, the whole magnificent machine was building, quietly and from the very first day, toward a morning when it would pass him by and roll onto a cousin. He did not think about that often. Not yet. He was too busy having everything. But the clause was there in the settlement, waiting, patient as stone. And the first attempt to answer it was already close at hand, in the person of a celebrated young beauty he was about to marry, a woman who would give him, for a few short years, exactly the son the estate demanded, before the cruelest of all his losses took the boy away. Chapter 3. The Bride and the Longed-For Son. He married for the first time in the opening year of the new century, and for a brief and shining, while it looked as though the future had arranged itself exactly as a duke's future was supposed to. On the 16th of February, 1901, Bendor married Constance Edwina Cornwallis West, known to everyone as Sheila. She was one of the celebrated beauties of the age, and she came from a family that sat close to the warm centre of Edwardian society. Sheila had been born in May of 1877 at Ruthin Castle in Denbighshire, in Wales, the youngest child of Colonel William Cornwallis West, a Member of Parliament and Lord Lieutenant of his county, and his wife, an Irish woman of famous beauty, who was known to all of fashionable London simply as Patsy. The Cornwallis West daughters were bred for brilliant marriages, and they made them. Sheila's sister became Daisy, Princess of Pless, mistress of one of the great houses of Imperial Germany, a fixture of the courts of Europe. Her brother, George Cornwallis West, married the widowed mother of Winston Churchill, the famous Jenny, so that the young officer Bendor had befriended on the veldt of South Africa was now bound to him by marriage as well as by war. It was a small, glittering, tightly interlaced world, in which the same few dozen families married and remarried one another across a single generation, and Bendor and Sheila stood near the very middle of it, young and rich and admired. They began their married life at Grosvenor House on Park Lane and moved out to the great rooms of Eaton Hall. And for a young duke recently come into an ocean of rent, the marriage seemed to promise everything a marriage was meant to promise. In the arithmetic of the aristocracy, a marriage was not only a matter of love, and often not chiefly a matter of love. It was an alliance and a transaction, and above all, a means of continuation, the mechanism by which one great family produced the heir who would carry its name and its lands into the next generation. On every count, Sheila was the ideal bride. She was beautiful. She was superbly connected. She was of the right rank and the right world. And she promised, above all else, the thing a duke married for. She promised an heir. That word, in the world Bendor moved in, carried a weight it is difficult now to feel. Among the great families of Edwardian England, marriage was the central instrument of dynastic survival, and a bride was chosen with at least half an eye to the succession she was expected to secure. Love was welcome where it came, and often it did, but it was not the point of the exercise, and everyone involved understood as much. A great marriage joined two bloodlines, two fortunes, two names, and its first business was the making of the next generation. The daughters of families like the Cornwallis Wests were raised knowing this, groomed for brilliant matches, and their value in the marriage market rose and fell with beauty and connection, and, unspoken but always present, the promise of healthy children. Sheila was, by every measure that world used, a superb match, and the marriage was celebrated as exactly the kind of union that kept the aristocracy going, one glittering family allied to another, with an heir, the expected and necessary result. The whole class was bound together this way, a few dozen families marrying and remarrying across a single generation until half of them were cousins to the other half. It was into precisely that web that Bendor had married. His wife's brother had taken Winston Churchill's mother to the altar. Her sister sat at the head of a great German house. The same names recurred at every wedding and every christening and every funeral, a closed circle of blood and land and rank. And the entail was the iron rule that ran beneath all of it, the reason the whole system cared so desperately about the sex of a child. A daughter, however loved, married out and carried her value to another family. A son stayed and inherited and kept the name alive. Everything turned on the boy, and for a few short years Bendor had his boy, and the system, for once, seemed to be working exactly as it was designed to. Within a few years, she had given him one, but a daughter came first. Lady Ursula Mary Olivia Grosvenor was born in 1902, and she was loved, and she was welcomed. And by the pitiless law of the entail, she could inherit nothing at all. A daughter could not carry the dukedom. A daughter could not hold the ground beneath Mayfair. However cherished she was as a child, in the cold ledger of the succession she did not count, and the whole enormous hope of the family narrowed again to a single point, the birth of a boy. On the 16th of November, 1904, that boy arrived. He was christened Edward George Hugh Grosvenor, and from the cradle he carried the courtesy title of Earl Grosvenor, the mark of the heir apparent, the name that said plainly to all the world that here was the future of the house. It is difficult, across the distance of more than a century, to feel how much weight rested on that one small child. But the weight was enormous. Edward was not merely a beloved son, though he was that. He was the future of the greatest private fortune in the country made flesh, the guarantee that the rent and the acres and the paintings would pass in an unbroken line, and that Bendor's own blood would go on holding them. Every great house in England understood exactly what a boy in that cradle meant. It meant the dynasty was safe. It meant the anxiety that shadows every entailed estate, The low, constant dread of the line running dry could be set aside for a generation. The richest man in Britain had done the one thing his fortune could not do for him. He had made an heir, a living boy with the right name and the right sex. And in doing it, he had, for a few years, silenced the one demand that would otherwise rule his life. For those few years, then, the picture was complete. There was the fortune, vast beyond ordinary imagining. There was the beautiful, well-connected wife. There was the little Earl Grosvenor growing in the nurseries of Eton Hall, and behind him a sister, and the sense of a household arranged around a future that seemed entirely secure. Photographs of the period show a golden family at the top of a golden age, the last long Edwardian summer before the Great War came to break it apart. Bendor was young, decorated, immensely rich, a husband and a father, the master of a line that would clearly continue. There was, on the face of it, nothing left for such a man to want. But a fortune like his has a way of teaching the man who holds it that having is not the same as keeping, and the lesson, when it came, would come through the nursery. The marriage was already carrying its own quiet strains beneath the golden surface. Bendor was restless by nature, a man who consumed pleasures and experiences and moved on, forever reaching for the next diversion, the next journey, the next thing. Sheila was spirited and admired, and not inclined to sit quietly at Eton while her husband ranged across his acres and his amusements. In a marriage between two such people, held together in its early years chiefly by rank and by the child, there were pressures that a single grief could crack wide open. Neither of them, in those first bright years, could have guessed how soon the grief would come, or how completely it would break them. For now, though, the child held, and while the child held, everything held. Edward was alive and healthy, and the future had a face and a name, and a small figure running in the gardens of the greatest house in Cheshire. The cruelty of what was coming lies precisely in how safe it all looked. The estate had its heir. The line was secure. The anxious clause in the settlement was answered, and the man who had everything stood, without the faintest idea of it, only a few short springs away from the morning that would take the one possession no fortune on earth could replace, and would go on taking, in its long aftermath, every marriage he made across the next 40 years to try to answer it again. Chapter 4. The heir to everything. For a handful of years at the start of the century, the greatest private fortune in England had a small boy at the centre of it, and the whole vast structure of the estate seemed, for that little while, entirely secure. This is the peak of Bendor's life, though he would not have named it so at the time, because at the time it simply looked like the natural order of things. A duke of his wealth was supposed to have an heir. He had one. The world was as it should be, and he moved through it with the untroubled confidence of a man whose essential work was done. Set the child against the scale of what he stood to inherit, and the completeness of the picture becomes clear. Little Edward, Earl Grosvenor, running in the nurseries and gardens of Eton Hall, was the sole male heir to more than 130,000 acres, to the freehold of half of Mayfair and Belgravia, to a house of 54 bedrooms hung with the work of Rembrandt and Goya, to yachts and hunting forests and a river of London rent that flowed without end. Everything the eye could see across the Cheshire Park, and a great deal it could not see in London and Scotland and France, was one day meant to be his. He was perhaps the most richly promised child in the country, a boy who had done nothing but be born, and had, by that single act, secured a dynasty stretching back centuries, and, it seemed, forward without limit. And the promise ran both ways, because the child secured his father as much as the father secured the child. So long as Edward lived, Bendor was not the last of his line, but a link in a chain. A man passing a great trust from the generation before him to the generation after. The anxiety that haunts every entailed estate, the dread of the name dying out and the whole fortune sliding sideways to some distant cousin, had no hold on him while his son drew breath. He could be careless, restless, extravagant, whatever his nature made him, because the essential thing was covered. The heir existed. The future had a name. Whatever Bendor did with his gilded days, the succession was safe. And a man who believes the succession is safe carries himself differently from a man who fears it is not. But the wiser families of that world knew never to rest on a single son, and the reason was written across every churchyard in the country. In the years before modern medicine, childhood was a dangerous passage even for the richest, and the aristocracy buried its children alongside everyone else. Fevers, infections, the sudden illnesses that no fortune could turn aside, all of them took the young without regard to rank. That is why the old families spoke, half grimly and half practically, of an heir and a spare, of the need for a second son in reserve against the loss of the first, because they had learned across generations that one boy was a thread and two were a rope. It was not sentiment that made them want a houseful of sons. It was arithmetic, the cold arithmetic of a world where a healthy child could sicken on a Monday and be buried by the end of the week. Bendor had a thread and no rope. He had exactly one son, and behind him only daughters, and daughters could not inherit. The whole vast future of the house hung on the continued health of a single small boy, with nothing held in reserve behind him. In a family more anxious, or simply more fortunate, there might have been a second son to stand as insurance against catastrophe. There was not. And so, for all the wealth and all the apparent security, the succession of the greatest fortune in Britain rested on the narrowest possible foundation, one child's life, in an age when a child's life was a fragile thing to build on. Nobody in the household was thinking such thoughts in that golden season. There was no reason to. The boy was well, and the sun was high, and the danger, when it came, would come without any warning at all. There is a particular kind of security that comes from having a son, when a son is precisely what the world demands of you, and Bendor had it in full. He had married well. He had produced the boy. He had, in the eyes of society and the law alike, discharged the first duty of his rank within a few short years of inheriting it. He had done in his early 20s what many men of his class agonized over for decades, the making of an heir, and he had done it almost without effort, as he did everything, as though the world had simply handed him a son the way it handed him his rent. Whatever else he chose to do with his life, on his horses and his yachts and his restless travels, the line was safe, and he could spend his attention on his pleasures with a clear conscience. He did not hover over the nursery. He did not need to. The nursery held the future, and the future, he assumed, would look after itself. It was the last long summer of a whole way of living, though no one inside it could have known so at the time. The Edwardian years, before the Great War came to tear the old world apart, were the golden afternoon of the English aristocracy, a season of country house parties and grand shooting weekends, of great families secure in their acres and their servants and their certainties, of a social order that seemed as fixed and permanent as the land itself. Bendor and his young family stood at the very top of that order, in the most golden corner of that golden afternoon, and around them everything spoke of continuity, of a world that would go on exactly as it was, handed down whole from one generation to the next, as it always had been. The war that would shatter it was still years away. The taxes that would break the great estates were still gathering. For now, there was only the long, warm certainty of a class that believed itself eternal. And in that certainty, the single small life at the centre of the Grosvenor future was simply assumed, never anxiously guarded. Why would it be otherwise? The boy was well. The house was warm. The doctors were the finest in the land, and the family had never in living memory wanted for anything it could not summon with money. The whole logic of that gilded world was that the rich were shielded, that catastrophe was a thing that happened to other people, in other houses, further down the great chain of rank. Bendor had every reason to believe his son was as safe as the rent, as permanent as the acres, as certain as the succession itself. The thought that the entire towering future might rest on something as fragile as one small boy's health, and might be undone in a single February week, would have seemed, in that long, secure summer, almost absurd. It was not absurd. It was exactly what was coming. Stay a moment in that brief, secure season, because everything that follows is measured against it. This is the high watermark, the one point in the whole long story when Hugh Grosvenor had, genuinely and completely, everything a man of his rank could want. The fortune was intact and growing. The marriage, whatever its private strains, had done its dynastic work. The heir was alive and thriving. There were 2 children in the house, a daughter and the precious son, and the sense of a family established at the very summit of the Edwardian world in the last years before that world was swept away. If the story had stopped here, it would be a story of nothing but golden luck. A man handed a kingdom and a son to leave it to, untroubled by the smallest cloud on the horizon. But the story does not stop here, and the very completeness of the picture is the measure of what is about to be lost. The whole towering structure, the rent and the acres and the paintings and the ancient name, rested in the end on the small chest of one 4-year-old boy, rising and falling in a nursery bed at Eton Hall. The entail had built a fortune that could only pass through a son, and Bendor had exactly one. There was no spare, no second boy in the cradle, no cushion against catastrophe. The heir to everything was a single child, and single children, in the years before modern medicine, were fragile things, however rich their fathers. In the household there was no sense of that fragility yet. Why should there have been? The boy was healthy. The doctors were the best money could buy. The nurseries were warm and well-staffed, and the family was rich beyond the reach of ordinary misfortune, or so it must have seemed. Wealth on Bendor's scale feels like a wall against the world, and it is, against most things, against hunger and cold, and the 1,000 small cruelties of ordinary life. It is a very high wall indeed. It is not a wall against illness in a child. That was the one door the money could not lock, and it stood, all through that golden season, quietly unbolted at the centre of the great house, waiting. In the early spring of the year that was coming, that door would open, and the golden season would end, and the richest man in Britain would learn, in the space of a few days, the exact limit of what his fortune could protect. Everything the money had built, the wall it had raised against the world, would prove to have one gap in it exactly the size of a small boy, and through that gap the whole secure future would drain away in less than a week. The heir to everything had a little while left. His father, moving through his palaces and his pleasures with the easy confidence of a man whose line was safe, did not know how little. Chapter 5. A small coffin at Eton. In the early spring of 1909, the heir to the greatest fortune in Britain fell ill in a nursery at Eton Hall, and within a few days he was dead. It was appendicitis, sudden and savage in an age before such a thing could be reliably treated, before the drugs and the surgery that would later make it a routine trouble of childhood. In the winter of that year, it was still a killer. The inflamed appendix, the operation attempted against it, the infection that could follow, all of it lay at the very edge of what the medicine of the time could manage, and for a small boy, the odds were cruel. It came for the one child in England who could least be spared, and the best doctor's money could buy could not turn it away. On the 13th of February, 1909, Edward George Hugh Grosvenor, Earl Grosvenor, died. He was 4 years old. There is a particular cruelty in the manner of it, because appendicitis is exactly the kind of death that money was supposed to prevent. This was not a slow, wasting disease that medicine of the day could do nothing about. It was a sudden, treatable, survivable thing. And only a few years later, it would be survived routinely, a childhood scare rather than a childhood tragedy. Edward had the finest doctors in the country, the best that limitless wealth could summon, and it made no difference at all, because in that particular winter, the surgery and the care that could have saved him were still just out of reach, hovering at the edge of the possible. A poor child, and the richest child in England, died of the same thing that year, and the fortune that stood between the Grosvenor boy and every other danger in the world could not stand between him and this one. The wall the money had raised had a gap in it precisely the size of a small inflamed organ, and through that gap the whole future of the house poured away in the space of a few days. For the household, it must have been a horror beyond describing, the sickening speed of it, the powerlessness of all that wealth. 1 week, there was a healthy heir running in the nurseries, the secure centre of a great family's future. The next, there was a small coffin, and a father wild with grief and rage, and a marriage cracking apart under the weight of a loss too large to share. The servants who had dressed the boy and fed him and watched him grow, the tutors and nurses whose whole employment was the care of the heir, all of them stood in the terrible helplessness that a great house feels when the one thing it exists to protect has been taken from it. Money could buy every comfort in the world for that child, except the one that mattered, which was to live. And its failure to buy that one thing broke something at the centre of the family that no amount of the rest could ever mend. The heir to more than 130,000 acres, to half of Mayfair and Belgravia, to Eaton Hall and its Rembrandts and its yachts and its rivers of rent, was carried out of a nursery in a coffin small enough for one man to bear. Everything the entail had been built to protect, the whole unbroken line stretching back through the Grosvenors and forward into a future that had seemed so secure, had rested on the narrow chest of that single boy, and now the boy was gone. There was no second son, no spare heir waiting in another cradle, no cushion of any kind. There was one child, and death had taken him. And in a few February days, the future that had looked so complete simply collapsed inward on itself and left a hollow where it had been. For Bendor, it was not only the grief that any father knows, though it was certainly that. It was the failure of his entire purpose as the holder of the estate. A duke exists, in the brutal logic of the entail, to pass the line on, to be the living bridge between the generation that came before and the generation that comes after. He had built that bridge once, in the person of his son, and death had torn it down, and now he was back exactly where he had started, at the age of 20, a man with an enormous fortune and no one of his own body to leave it to. The difference was that he was no longer 20. Almost a decade had gone by. He had married and made an heir and buried him, and the marriage that had produced the boy was already, at the moment of the boy's death, coming apart at the seams. He had spent his one clear chance, and it had ended in a small grave, and the clock that governs every man's fertility had begun, quietly, to run against him. What happened around the deathbed poisoned everything that came after it. By the accounts that survive, Sheila was away when the child sickened and died, absent from Eton at the crucial hour, and in his grief and his fury, Bendor turned on his wife. He accused her, it is said, of neglecting their son, of being off in the company of other men while the boy lay dying. Whether that accusation was fair is impossible to know at this distance, and it should be treated as what it was, the bitter charge of a devastated man against a wife he was already half estranged from, not a settled fact of history. Grief makes people cruel, and it makes them unjust, and a marriage that is already failing can turn a shared loss into a weapon rather than a bond. What is documented, and what tells its own cold story, is that Sheila did not attend the boy's funeral. Mother and father, already drifting apart, were driven by the death of their only son, not together in grief, but violently apart, each blaming the other, or unable to bear the sight of the other, in the ruin of the thing they had made together. There is a detail that fixes the loss in stone, quite literally, and it is the most eloquent thing Bendor ever did. He could not bring his son back, but he could do the thing that great wealth does with grief. He could build. He commissioned a memorial to the boy, and it was no small marker. He set the young architect Detmar Blow to design it, with the sculptor Emile Madeleine to carve it, and the finished monument was completed in 1910 and placed at the grave in the churchyard of the little church at Eccleston, close to the gates of Eton Hall. It stands there still, a stone memorial to a 4-year-old boy on ground within sight of the great house he would have inherited. Of all the things the richest man in Britain ever built, of all the houses and the collections and the grand improvements to his estates, that small memorial to Edward is the one that says the most, because it marks the exact place where his fortune met the limit of its power. Everything else he built was an expression of what money could do. This one thing was a monument to what money could not, and here the shape of the whole rest of his life is already visible, if anyone had known to look. He was a man in early middle age, catastrophically rich, whose marriage was finished in all but name, and whose only heir lay under a new stone at Eccleston. Everything the estate demanded of him, it demanded again, from the very beginning. He needed a wife who could give him a son, and the wife he had was lost to him, and the son he had made was gone. The entail did not soften at the graveside. The entail did not care about his grief. It wanted an heir, and it would go on wanting one, coldly and without pity, through every year and every marriage still to come. He would answer that demand the only way he knew how, by acquiring. He had acquired houses and horses and yachts and the good opinion of the world. Now he would set about acquiring wives, one after another, in the belief that the thing that had failed could be replaced the way a lost possession is replaced, by simply buying another. It is the logic of a man who has never learned that some things do not answer to the will or the purse, and Bendor had never learned it, because until now, nothing in his gilded life had ever taught it to him. A son, it would turn out, was one of those things. He had lost the only one he would ever make, and the losing of him broke the first marriage past all mending. What remained of that marriage now had only to be formally, expensively, and very publicly brought to an end, and even in its ending it would set a record, because everything Bendor touched turned sooner or later into a matter of sheer astonishing scale. Chapter 6. The largest divorce in England. The marriage did not end in a single scene. It ended the way such marriages usually ended among people of that rank, slowly, coldly, and then all at once in a courtroom, with a settlement large enough to make the newspapers gasp. After the death of the boy, there was one more child. Lady Mary Constance Grosvenor was born in the summer of 1910, a little over a year after her brother died, and she lived a long life and became in time a spirited woman, who drove fast cars and rally cars, but she was a daughter, and a daughter could carry nothing forward. So even the last child of the first marriage, born into the very shadow of the lost heir, did nothing to answer the one question that ruled her father's life. 2 daughters now survived, Ursula and Mary. The son did not. And the parents, bound together by little beyond rank, and the children, had all but stopped being married in anything but law. They separated in 1913. From that point, each went a separate way, and each, by the accounts of the time, went in the company of others. Sheila's name was linked with the Duke of Alba, a Spanish grandee of the highest rank, and Bendor pursued his own restless nocturnal life with the freedom of a man who answered to no one and had the money to indulge every appetite. It was, on both sides, the open, secret arrangement that so many aristocratic marriages of the period settled into, once the essential business of heirs was done or ruined. 2 people living separate lives under a shared and increasingly hollow title. Then the Great War came in 1914 and scattered the fashionable world, and gave everyone far larger things to think about, and it also gave Sheila her finest hour. Whatever had gone wrong inside the marriage, the woman Bendor was discarding was no idle society ornament, and the war proved it. She threw herself into the war effort with real energy and organization, sponsoring and running a military hospital at Le Touquet on the French coast, housed in a requisitioned casino, tending the wounded of the Western Front within sound of the guns. It was serious, sustained, difficult work, and it was recognized. In 1918, she was appointed a commander of the Order of the British Empire for her service. The wife Bendor would blame and cast off had run a hospital through the greatest war the world had yet seen, and been decorated by her country for it, and that fact deserves to sit beside the deathbed accusation as a corrective to it. The formal end of the marriage came after the war, on the 19th of December 1919, and here the sheer size of Bendor's fortune turned even the ending of his marriage into a record. In the convention of the time, it was the husband who took the public blame for the breakdown, shielding the wife's reputation by accepting the fault himself, and Bendor followed the convention. The divorce was granted on the grounds of his own adultery and desertion. He took the blame so that his wife need not carry it, which was the gentlemanly form of the age, and then he paid for the arrangement on a scale that no one had ever seen. To understand why the arrangement took the shape it did, it helps to remember how difficult and how shaming divorce still was in that generation. It was not the quiet legal formality it would later become. It was rare and expensive, and carried a heavy stain, especially for a woman who could find herself shut out of the drawing rooms and the great houses that had once received her. Her name quietly struck from the invitation lists. The law itself was weighted with all of this. A marriage could not simply be ended because 2 people had ceased to love each other, or had grown apart, or had been driven asunder by a shared grief. Fault had to be proved, adultery named, blame assigned to one party or the other in open court for the newspapers to report. And so the couples of Bendor's class evolved their own grim etiquette around it, in which the husband, better able to bear the stain, would take the guilt upon himself, arrange to be found at fault, and shield the wife's reputation by falling on the sword of his own admitted adultery. That is what Bendor did for Sheila, and it was, in its cold way, a kind of courtesy. He let the blame fall on him so that she could keep her standing in the world they both inhabited, and then he sealed the arrangement with the largest settlement English law had ever recorded, an income that would keep her in the manner of a duchess for the rest of her life. It was generosity and guilt and convention all bound together, the act of a man who could not save his marriage or his son, but could at least pay, lavishly, to end the one with dignity for the woman he had once married. The record sum made the newspapers marvel. But the marvelling missed the real story, which was not the size of the cheque. It was that the greatest fortune in Britain had once again been spent, freely and enormously, on a thing that money could smooth, but could never truly mend. The settlement gave Sheila an income of £13,000 a year, a sum worth well over £500,000 in the money of today, and it was reported at the time as the largest such settlement in the whole history of English law. Sit with what that figure says about the man. Even the unwinding of a failed marriage became, in his hands, a thing of record-breaking scale, the biggest divorce settlement England had ever known, handed over almost as easily as he granted those peppercorn leases in Pimlico. The money simply was not the point, because the money never ran out and never could. He could buy his way out of a marriage as smoothly as he had bought his way into every other thing he wanted, and the world would report the sum and marvel at it, and the river of rent would flow on and cover the whole enormous settlement without a ripple on its surface. There was something almost careless in it, the way a man who has never counted his money hands over a fortune to be free, and it is of a piece with everything else about him. He could pay any price the world named, and paying was always easy, and the only prices that ever cost him anything were the ones that could not be paid in money at all. There is a strange grace note to the ending. Having blamed her for the death of their son, having separated from her and divorced her and paid her that record sum, Bendor then settled into something almost like friendship with the woman he had cast off. In the years that followed, he and Sheila were on cordial terms again, and they were seen together at the great occasions of their daughters' lives, jointly hosting the coming-out balls by which Ursula and Mary were launched into society. The rage of the deathbed had cooled, across the years, into a wary civility. It is one of the recurring notes of Bendor's whole strange history with women, that the storms passed and left behind a kind of settled truce, and that the wives he divorced so expensively did not, on the whole, become his enemies. Sheila herself lived on for another half-century after their marriage ended, dying at last in 1970 at the age of 92, long after the man who had married her and blamed her and paid her that record sum was in his own grave. But in 1919, freshly and expensively single, Bendor was a man in his early 40s with the same hole at the centre of his life that had opened when his son died 10 years before. He had a fortune beyond counting and no heir to leave it to. He had 2 daughters who could inherit nothing. He had a divorce behind him, the largest on record, and a first marriage that had produced 1 dead boy and a great deal of grief. The entail was exactly as hungry as it had been on the day he came into the estate, and now the man who had to feed it was no longer young. Every year that passed was a year gone from the span in which he might still make another son, and he knew it, and he wasted very little time. Within the year, he would marry again, a woman freshly divorced herself, and that second marriage would prove the emptiest of all his attempts, a brief union that gave him nothing at all and dissolved almost as quickly as it was made. Chapter 7. Married again within the year. Less than a year after the largest divorce in English history, the Duke of Westminster married a woman who had only just finished a divorce of her own, and the union they made together produced precisely nothing. Her name was Violet Mary Nelson. She had been born in 1891 in Liverpool, the daughter of a baronet, Sir William Nelson, and she came to Bendor with a first marriage already behind her. That first husband had been a man named George Rowley, whom she had married in the spring of 1914 and divorced in 1920, which is why she surfaces in some of the records of the period as Violet Rowley, still carrying the name of the husband she had only just shed. Freshly free, she married Bendor on the 26th of November, 1920, only months after her own divorce was finalised and only months after his. It had the look, from the outside, of two people of the same restless set, pairing off in the aftermath of their separate wreckages. Bendor needed a wife who might give him the son the estate demanded, and he needed her soon, because the years were moving. Violet was young enough, in her late 20s, and newly available, and moved in his world. On paper, it answered the requirement. She was of the right sort, unattached, of childbearing age, willing to become a duchess. In practice, it answered nothing at all. The marriage gave him no children, no son, no heir, nothing whatsoever to set against the empty place the entail kept open at the centre of his fortune. Whatever had drawn the two of them together, whether affection or convenience, or the simple momentum of two recently divorced people in the same narrow social world, it did not produce the one thing Bendor most needed a marriage to produce. And without that, the union had no ballast and no purpose. It drifted, and it foundered. And by 1926, after some 6 years, it was quietly dissolved. There is remarkably little to say about those 6 years, and the thinness of the record is itself the point. The first marriage had produced a beloved son, and a terrible grief, and a record-breaking divorce, high drama at every turn, the stuff of legend. The second produced almost nothing worth the recording, a brief and childless interval that began without ceremony and ended without much either. It is the marriage of a man going through the motions of the thing he believed he was supposed to do, taking a wife because a duke without a wife has no route to an heir, and discovering that the taking of a wife on its own solved nothing. A wedding was easy to arrange, as easy as buying a house. A son was another matter altogether, and no ceremony could conjure one where none would come. Violet was the second name on a list that would run to 4, and of the 4, she is the faintest, the one the story hurries past, precisely because the marriage itself gave the story so little to hold on to. It is a blank stretch, a first attempt at replacement that replaced nothing, and the blankness is telling in itself, because it shows the method already failing. Bendor had approached the problem of the missing heir the way he approached every problem, as a matter of acquisition. Something was lacking, therefore something must be obtained. He had lost a son, so he would obtain a wife who might make another, the way a man who has lost a horse buys a horse, or a man who has lost a house buys a house. The logic is flawless if the thing you need can be bought. It falls apart entirely if the thing you need cannot. A wife could be found and married inside a year, as easily as anything else in his life. A son could not be found at all, only hoped for, only waited on, and no amount of decisiveness or wealth could hurry him into being. The second marriage was the first clear proof that the old, reliable method, the method of simply acquiring the thing that was missing, would not work on this particular want. It would take Bendor a very long time, and 3 more marriages, to accept a lesson the second marriage had already taught him in full. Violet passed on into her own life, 3 times a wife, and the years she spent as Duchess of Westminster left no trace on the succession, and, one suspects, little enough on her. She had married a rich and difficult man on the rebound from her own divorce, spent 6 childless years in his restless orbit, and then stepped out of it and married again, an ordinary enough story dressed up in an extraordinary title. For Bendor, though, the marriage was another year gone, another stretch of the fertile middle of his life spent on a union that produced nothing, and behind it, all through those same years, the great distraction was already taking hold. The affair that would consume the rest of the decade and end in the one refusal he could never buy his way past. She, for her part, did not linger long in the wreckage either. Within a year of her divorce from Bendor, she had married again, taking as her third husband a naval officer, Lieutenant Commander Frederick Cripps, and passing out of the Grosvenor story into a life of her own that had nothing more to do with dukes or entails. Like the wives before and after her, she had a full existence of which Bendor was only ever one passage. She lived on until 1983, a woman who had been married 3 times and been briefly, childlessly, a Duchess of Westminster in the middle of it. The dukedom had touched her and moved on, leaving no mark on the succession at all, and she left no mark on it either. It was, for both of them, a marriage that need scarcely have happened for all the difference it made to the great question of the heir. But the timing of that second marriage matters far more than its emptiness, because of what was happening in Bendor's life in the very years it was falling apart. It was during the marriage to Violet, as it cooled and failed and slid toward its end, that the greatest romance of Bendor's life began, with a woman he could never make his wife and would spend years trying to. While the second Duchess of Westminster was still, in law, his wife, Bendor met and fell for a Frenchwoman who had built her own fortune from nothing and had not the smallest intention of dissolving it into his. Her name was Gabrielle Chanel, and the world knew her as Coco. The failing marriage to Violet and the rising affair with Chanel overlapped and tangled together across the middle years of the 1920s. The wife gave him no child and could not hold him. The mistress held him completely and would give him nothing the estate could use, because she would not marry him at all. It is a bitter arrangement when it is set out plainly. The woman he was married to could not answer the great question of his life, and the woman who had seized his whole attention refused even to let the question be asked of her in a way that counted. Between the two of them, Bendor passed the years in which a man in his 40s still might, with the right wife, have made another heir. And he made none, because his marriage was hollow and his heart was elsewhere, fixed on a woman who owned her own name and meant to keep it whatever coronet he dangled before her. By the time the marriage to Violet was formally dissolved in 1926, then the pattern of the rest of his life was already set hard. He would pursue the one woman he truly wanted, and she would refuse him. And around that central refusal, he would go on marrying others who could not give him what the first small grave at Eccleston had taken away. The second marriage had ended, having answered nothing and continued nothing. The great refusal, the one that would define these middle years of his life and pass into legend, was only just beginning, out on the sunlit decks of a black-hulled yacht. Chapter 8. The one woman who would not marry him. In the years his second marriage was quietly dying, the richest man in Britain gave his heart, completely and helplessly, to the one woman in Europe who would not take it on the only terms he could offer, which were the terms of a wife. She was introduced to him in Monte Carlo over the winter of 1923 and into 1924, a small, sharp-eyed, plainly dressed Frenchwoman who had come up from nothing and built an empire on her own name. He was in his middle 40s. She was near 40, and from almost the first meeting he pursued her the way he pursued everything, without a shadow of doubt that he would win. She was Gabrielle Chanel, called Coco, and she was the opposite of him in every way that mattered. He had been handed a fortune at birth and had built nothing. She had been born poor and had built everything she owned with her own 2 hands. By the time Bendor met her, she commanded her own house of couture, her own perfume that sold and sold around the world, her own money in her own bank, her own name above her own door. She answered to no father, no husband, no patron. In an age that expected a woman of her low birth to end as a servant or as some rich man's kept mistress, she had made herself a genuine power, and she had done it without inheriting a single acre of anyone's rent. Where Bendor's wealth was the oldest kind, land and rent and inheritance, Hers was the newest, a commercial empire built on taste and work and her own relentless will. Bendor courted her on the only scale he knew, the scale of pure abundance. He swept her aboard the black-hulled schooner, the Flying Cloud, and they cruised the Mediterranean and the Atlantic together. He brought her north to the salmon rivers of Scotland and south to the boar hunts of Mimizan, where even Winston Churchill, staying with his old friend, met the famous dressmaker and sent home warm reports of her, calling her impressive company. Bendor gave and gave and gave, in the only language for affection he had ever learned. He gave her ropes of natural pearls and loose emeralds and a painting by a French master. In 1927, he gave her a parcel of land on the hills above the Riviera at Roquebrune, and on it she built a white villa she called La Pausa, designing it herself down to the last detail. Across the years of the affair, the biographers reckon, his total outlay on her ran into the modern equivalent of tens of millions of pounds. It was one of the great courtships in the whole history of the rich. The gifts were not the small tokens that pass between ordinary lovers. They were the kind of objects that change hands between nations. He gave her the long ropes of natural pearls that became, in time, part of her signature. Real pearls of the sort hunted from the sea before culturing made them common, worth a fortune in themselves. He gave her loose emeralds and unset sapphires by the handful, as another man might give flowers. He gave her Old English silver and Russian icons and Tudor furniture out of his own collections, and the painting by the French master for her wall. And he gave her the villa, La Pausa, the one thing he built for her, rather than merely bought, a low white house above the Mediterranean at Roquebrune, which she designed herself with a young architect and shaped, it was said, around a memory of the convent staircase of her childhood. It was the perfect emblem of the whole affair, a duke's gift to a mistress, turned by the woman who received it into a monument to the poverty he could never have understood. Behind all of it stood the figure who had brought them together, Vera Bott Lombardi, a society fixer who moved easily between the worlds of fashion and aristocracy, and who had introduced the Duke to the dressmaker in Monte Carlo. It was she, by some accounts, who later pressed on Bendor the hard fact that Chanel was nearing the end of her childbearing years, and that if he truly wanted a son from her, he could not afford to wait. That single detail is the hinge between the romance and the tragedy at the centre of this whole story, because it turns the affair from a grand indulgence into another chapter of the same desperate search. Bendor did not only want Chanel, he wanted, through her, the heir that everything still turned upon, and the clock that had been running against him since his son died in 1909 was running still, louder now, as he poured his fortune over a woman who would take the pearls and keep the villa, and never, on any terms, become his wife. And she took the gifts, and she was not bought by them, and that is the heart of the matter. She wore his long ropes of pearls in the layered way that became part of her own signature look. She kept his villa and filled it with her own past, designing every corner of it herself. She enjoyed the yachts and the cruises, and went on running her business through all of it, deciding, designing, ruling her own empire while she sailed on his. The other women in Bendor's world had been transformed by wealth into ornaments of it, hostesses and duchesses defined by the men who kept them. Chanel absorbed his wealth into her own style and remained, stubbornly and completely, herself. He was pouring the world over her, and she was quietly turning every piece of it into more of her own. Then he asked her to marry him, and the richest man in Britain heard the word he had almost never heard in his life. He proposed, and he proposed more than once across the years of the affair, and each time she refused. He was not asking only for love. He was asking her, though he may never have put it so baldly, to solve the great problem of his existence. He had buried his only son. 2 marriages had given him no other. Here was a woman he adored, and if she would marry him and give him a boy, the long anxiety of the entail would be answered at last. The friend who had introduced them is said to have pressed exactly that point on him, that Chanel was nearing the end of her childbearing years, and that if he wanted a son from her, he could not afford to wait. So the proposals carried a double weight: the longing of a man for a particular woman, and the desperation of a duke who could feel his line dying with him. He was not only asking her to be his wife, he was asking her to save the house of Grosvenor from the sideways fall that awaited it, and still she said no. Not in a single dramatic scene, but steadily, finally, across years. To marry him, she would have had to become his, ranked by his rank, housed in his houses, named by his name. And she had spent her whole life making certain she would never again be defined by anyone. To become the Duchess of Westminster, she would have had to stop being Coco Chanel, and being Coco Chanel was the only thing she had ever truly owned, the one possession no man had given her and no man could take away. She watched the way his world swallowed women whole and turned them into hostesses and breeders of heirs, and she had no intention of being swallowed. She would rather be the freest woman in Europe than the next in a long line of duchesses, and so she refused the coronet, the castle, the rent of half of Mayfair. The whole world he laid at her feet. Her refusal is remembered, fittingly, in a single perfect sentence that she may never actually have spoken. "There have been several Duchesses of Westminster," she is supposed to have said, "but there is only one Chanel." It is too good a line, and in her old age she is reported to have denied ever saying it, and her careful biographers have suggested it more likely grew out of a compliment paid to her across a lunch table by a diplomat in Paris. So the honest position is that the sentence is very likely a beautiful invention, or a borrowed compliment dressed up over the years as defiance. And it does not matter in the least, because it is true whoever first said it. There were several duchesses. Bendor married 4 women across his life, and not one of them was Chanel. There is, a century on, still only one Chanel, her name on an empire that outlived them both, and outlives them yet. The affair wound down around 1930, after roughly 6 years, ending not in a rupture, but in the slow recognition that the answer would always be no. And it left Bendor exactly where the deaths and divorces had always left him, only older and more tired, and further from what he needed. He was past 50 now. He had loved the one woman he could not have, and in loving her, he had passed the years in which he might most easily have made an heir with someone else. 2 marriages lay behind him, both childless in the end, and the great refusal on the decks of the yacht had closed the door on the 3rd possibility, the one he had wanted most of all. The estate still hungered for a son. The man was running out of the years in which to make one. And within months of Chanel's final no, Bendor would do the thing he always did with a wound. He would cover it, immediately and publicly, by marrying someone else, a suitable young Englishwoman who could be had precisely because she was everything Chanel had refused to be. Chapter 9. A society wedding in another woman's shadow. Barely 5 months after Coco Chanel refused him for the last time, the Duke of Westminster married a duchess of the proper English kind, with Winston Churchill standing at his shoulder as best man. On the 20th of February, 1930, Bendor took as his 3rd wife Loelia Mary Ponsonby, and the wedding was the society event of the season, a blaze of photographers and grand names and public delight. It was also, from the very first, a marriage conducted in the shadow of the woman who had said no. Loelia was exactly the sort of woman the world had always expected Bendor to marry, and exactly the sort Chanel had refused to become. She had been born in February of 1902, the only daughter of Sir Frederick Ponsonby, a courtier so close to the crown that he served 3 sovereigns in turn, and was raised in time to the peerage as Baron Ponsonby. She had grown up inside the royal household world, at the very centre of English court society, among the private secretaries and equerries and ladies-in-waiting who ran the intimate machinery of the monarchy. She carried the manners and the connections of that world as naturally as she breathed. She knew how to move through a palace, how to manage a great house, how to be a duchess, in a way that a self-made Frenchwoman from a convent orphanage never would have consented to learn. That contrast is the quiet engine of the whole third marriage, and it is worth holding on to. Chanel had refused Bendor precisely because she would not dissolve her own name and empire into his. Loelia had been raised, from birth, to do the very opposite, to take her identity from the great man she married, to become an extension of his rank and his household, to run his houses and grace his table and carry his name. She was, in that sense, the anti-Chanel, the woman built by her upbringing to be exactly what the Frenchwoman had refused to become. And Bendor married her, one cannot help feeling, at least partly for that reason, because after the maddening independence of the woman who would not be owned, here was a woman who had been prepared her whole life to belong. What he seems not to have reckoned on was that a woman raised to belong to a man is not the same as a woman with no self of her own to surrender, and the gap between what he wanted and what she was would become the private misery of the marriage. The wedding itself belonged to the whole nation for a day. The society columns filled with it, the crowds gathered, the photographers pressed in. The richest man in Britain and his lovely young bride, the picture of a fairy tale come true. It had all the outward marks of the grandest kind of happiness, the great friend as best man, the flowers and the crowds, and the sense of an occasion the whole country could share in. And beneath every inch of the spectacle ran the same hollow that had run beneath his life for 20 years. The missing son, the anxious clause, the reason a man of 51 was standing at an altar again with a bride half his age. The public saw a triumph. The private truth was a man making one more attempt in front of the cameras, at the only thing that had ever eluded him. When she married Bendor, she was 28 years old. He was 51, twice divorced, immensely rich, and freshly wounded by the greatest refusal of his life. The gap between them was more than 20 years, and it was more than years. It was the gap between a young woman at the start of her adult life and a man well into the second half of his, a man who had already loved and married and buried and been refused. The wedding itself was a spectacle worthy of the fortune behind it. That Churchill agreed to stand as best man tells you how deep the friendship between the two men ran. And it also lends the day a strange dramatic symmetry, because Churchill was the same friend who only a few years earlier had been meeting Chanel on the boar hunts at Mimizan and sending home his warm, approving reports of her. The man who had watched the great love affair at close quarters now stood witness to its hurried public replacement. It was almost too neat, the old friend present at both the height of the thing that failed and the ceremony that was meant to bury it, the same familiar face in the photographs of a courtship that ended in nothing and a marriage that began in haste. For that is what the marriage was, in its bones, a papering over. Bendor had asked the one woman he truly wanted, and she had refused him. And rather than sit with that refusal, he did the thing he had always done with a want he could not satisfy. He reached at once for the nearest acceptable thing. Loelia could be had. She was young, well-born, suitable in every way that Chanel had refused to be, and she came without the maddening independence that had made the Frenchwoman impossible to own. She would take the title. she would take the houses. She would, he must have hoped, in time give him the son that everything still turned upon. On paper, once again, the marriage answered the requirement precisely. She was of childbearing age, of the right rank, willing to become his duchess. Once again, as with Violet before her, the paper and the reality would prove to be very different things. Because a marriage made in the shadow of another woman begins already half defeated, and everyone close to this one seems to have sensed it from the start. Bendor had married too fast, on the rebound from a refusal he had not begun to digest, to a woman who had the great misfortune to be the visible replacement for someone the whole world knew he had wanted more. The new Duchess of Westminster stepped into a role that had been, in the Duke's own heart, offered first to a Frenchwoman who turned it down flat. She was living inside an absence. The wife who held the title the one woman he loved had refused to hold, the successor to a predecessor who had never even accepted the post. It is a difficult foundation to build a marriage on, the sense of being the second choice made in grief and haste. And the marriage that was built on it would turn out to be one of the unhappiest unions in a class famous for its unhappy unions. None of that was visible on the wedding day, of course. On the day there was only the spectacle, the crowds outside, the great friend as best man, the richest man in Britain, taking a well-born bride half his age with all the pomp his fortune could command. The photographs show a triumph. The society columns reported a triumph. The public, reading of it over breakfast, saw a fairy tale. The aging Duke and his lovely young Duchess, the grandest match of the year. And behind the triumph stood the same hollow place that had stood behind everything since a February morning at Eton 21 years before. The estate still had no heir. The Duke had simply acquired his third wife, in the settled hope that acquisition would at last produce the one thing acquisition had never yet produced in all his life. He was 51 years old, and time was no longer his ally in any way. He had one more real chance, perhaps, to make the son the entail demanded, and he was staking it on a marriage entered in haste and grief and the long shadow of Chanel, to a woman young enough to hope for children, but yoked to a man growing harder and stranger with the years. Within the private rooms of the great houses, away from the cameras and the columns, the truth of the union would show itself soon enough, and the truth was bleak. The society wedding of the season was the beginning of what one witness who knew them both would call, with brutal economy, a definition of unadulterated hell. Chapter 10. A definition of unadulterated hell. By the account of the woman who lived it, life as the third Duchess of Westminster was a gilded restlessness beside a man who could not be still and could not be pleased. Loelia left a record, which is more than the other wives did, and it is the closest thing this story has to a witness from inside one of Bendor's marriages. Her memoir, published in 1961 under the title Grace and Favour, with a foreword by Noel Coward, is the voice of a woman looking back on the union across 30 years, and it must be read as exactly that, the partial, wounded, retrospective account of an unhappy wife, and not as a neutral history. With that caution held firmly in place throughout, it remains a remarkable document, because it lets the reader stand for a moment inside the daily weather of a marriage to the richest man in Britain and see the private cost behind the public grandeur. And the weather, by her telling, was exhausting. The life was one of ceaseless movement, a restless circuit between the great houses and the yachts and the continental estates that never settled anywhere long enough to become a home. There was Eaton Hall in Cheshire, and the Scottish Lodge in the far north, and the places in France, and the vessels on the sea. And the household moved among them at the Duke's restless will, packing and unpacking, arriving and departing, forever in motion and forever, somehow, arriving nowhere. To an outsider, it might have sounded like a fairy tale, an endless progress between palaces, servants at every door, the finest of everything at every stop. In the living of it, by her account, it was a kind of luxurious imprisonment, a life with no fixed centre of its own, ruled entirely by the moods and the whims of a man who was himself always looking for the next place, the next diversion, the next thing that might finally quiet the hunger in him. She did not choose where she lived or when she moved. She followed, as the whole household followed, in the wake of his restlessness. And the household that followed him was itself enormous, which made the restlessness a small daily catastrophe rather than a private eccentricity. To move a man like Bendor from one house to another was to move an entire establishment, the servants and the luggage and the horses and the motor cars, the whole apparatus of a great life uprooted and set down again somewhere new, only to be uprooted once more before it had properly settled. A wife at the centre of that could never build the small, ordinary comforts that make a house a home, because no house was ever home for long. There was always another one waiting, another journey planned, another sudden decision to be somewhere else. Loelia's memoir catches the strange, exhausting texture of it, the sense of luxury without rest, of a life that had everything a person could name except the one thing she seems to have wanted most, which was a still point, a place to simply be. It is one of the small ironies of great wealth that it can buy every comfort and still fail to deliver contentment, and the third marriage is a case study in exactly that failure. Loelia had married into more houses than she could count, more servants than she could name, a fortune that could summon anything on earth to her door. And she was, by her own careful account, unhappy, worn down by a husband who could not be pleased and could not be still, trapped inside a grandeur that gave her no peace. The marriage had the form of a fairy tale and the substance of a slow imprisonment, and the gap between the two, between what it looked like from outside and what it felt like from within, is the very gap this whole channel exists to sit inside, the distance between the public grandeur and the private cost. For the hunger was the heart of the trouble. Bendor was, by this stage of his life, a difficult man and growing steadily more difficult. The easy, golden charm of his youth had begun to thicken into something heavier and darker, a restlessness that curdled into suspicion, a temper that could turn without warning and leave a whole household walking on eggshells. He was used to being the sun that a whole world arranged itself around, and he expected a wife to arrange herself around him too, to follow the endless movement without complaint, to absorb the moods, to make no demands of her own and have no centre that was not his. Loelia, clever and well-born and raised at the very heart of the royal household, was not a woman with no inner life of her own to surrender, and the surrender the marriage demanded of her was total. The friction between what he required and what she was, between his need for a wife who was purely an extension of himself and her stubborn, separate personhood, shows through every careful, unhappy page she wrote. Others saw it from outside and put it more harshly than she ever allowed herself to in print. The diarist James Lees Milne, who moved through the same aristocratic world and observed its marriages with a cold, clear eye, described the union of Bendor and Loelia as a definition of unadulterated hell. It is a phrase that has clung to the marriage ever since, and nothing in Loelia's own memoir, for all its discretion and its careful loyalty to appearances, works to contradict it. Here were two people yoked together in enormous wealth and deep incompatibility, one of them restless and suspicious and impossible to satisfy, the other trapped inside his moods and his ceaseless motion, and the years ground on with no relief and no purpose to redeem them. And through it all ran the same failure that had shadowed every marriage before it. Loelia and Bendor had no children. By her own account, they were unable to have them, and so the third marriage, like the second, gave the estate nothing, no son, no heir, no answer to the entail that had ruled the whole of Bendor's life. He had married a young, well-born, suitable wife, precisely so that she might give him the boy his line required, and she could not. And the marriage that had begun in the shadow of Chanel's refusal settled into a long, childless misery, with no dynastic purpose left to hold it together, and no affection to take its place. Whatever the marriage had been meant to be, it had failed at the one task that had been its real reason, and both of them, one imagines, knew it. It did not so much end as slowly stop. Bendor and Loelia drifted into separation, living apart for years while the marriage remained, in law, unbroken. The restless Duke went on with his restless life, and the Duchess he had married in such haste withdrew from the ceaseless circuit of houses, and the two of them became, in effect, strangers who happened to share a title and a memory of a wedding that had promised so much. The formal divorce, when it finally came, would not arrive until 1947, 17 long years after that glittering wedding, and by then the marriage had been a dead thing in all but law for the better part of 2 decades. Loelia herself, it should be said, was not destroyed by any of it. Like the wives before her, she had a full life beyond Bendor, and after his death she would marry again and live on for many years, an author and a figure in society in her own right, remembered as much for the memoir that preserved these unhappy years as for the coronet she had worn so uncomfortably. But in the long middle stretch of Bendor's life, through the whole of the 1930s and into the war, she was the wife inside the gilded misery, the witness to a man growing steadily stranger and darker inside the largest fortune in Britain. And it was in exactly those years, as the third marriage curdled and the estate stayed heirless, that the darkness in Bendor stopped being merely a matter of temper and moods and turned into something a good deal uglier and harder to forgive. Chapter 11. The Darkening. The easy charm that had carried him through the first half of his life thickened, in the second half, into something heavier, more suspicious, and at last genuinely ugly. The Bendor of the 1930s was no longer the golden young duke who had ridden out of the veldt into a fortune and a friendship with Churchill. He was a man past middle age, on his third unhappy marriage, still without the heir his whole existence had been arranged to produce, and the disappointment and the restlessness had begun to sour him from the inside out. He drank. He grew suspicious and difficult, and prone to dark moods and long grudges that he nursed for years. The appetite that had always driven him from pleasure to pleasure now found less and less that satisfied it, and a man who has spent his whole life believing that the next thing will finally content him becomes a bitter figure when the next thing keeps arriving and keeps failing to fill him. He moved between his houses with a restlessness that no longer led anywhere or promised anything. The brilliant friends of his youth fell away, or were driven off by his temper and his suspicion, and the glittering circle that had once revolved around him thinned year by year. He rattled around inside his enormous life, one of the richest men on earth and one of the least content, forever looking for something to want that he had not already had and grown tired of. The contrast with his youth is the saddest measure of what he became. As a young duke, he had been the brightest figure in a brilliant world, the man everyone wanted at their table, generous and golden and easy, riding out of a war into a friendship with the future saviour of his country. The great and the clever had gathered around him because being near him was a pleasure, by his later years that gravity had reversed. The pleasure had drained out of him, and the world that had once arranged itself around his charm arranged itself instead to stay clear of his moods. A man who has been adored all his life and then finds the adoration curdling into avoidance is a lonely figure indeed. And Bendor, for all his houses full of servants and his wife and his enormous wealth, grew steadily, unmistakably alone. And the loneliness had a specific shape, because at the centre of it stood the absence that had made everything else feel hollow. Other men grew old, surrounded by their sons and grandsons, watching the next generation take up the name, seeing something of themselves carried forward into a future they would not live to see. Bendor had none of that consolation. He had no son to teach the estate to, no boy to walk the Cheshire Park with, and tell that all of it would one day be his. There was only the long procession of wives, and the daughters who could inherit nothing, and the cousins somewhere in the wings who would take it all when he was gone. He had spent his whole life at the head of a great continuing thing, and he faced its end knowing that the continuing would happen without him, around him, past him, into other hands. And in these years, his decline took a turn that no honest account of his life can pass over or excuse. Bendor drifted into open sympathy with Nazi Germany. He moved in the circles that argued for friendship with Hitler's regime and against another war with it, and his private views carried a real and documented streak of anti-Semitism. This is not a matter of interpretation or of rumour or of a single unguarded remark. It is part of the settled record of the man, and it is indefensible, and it should not be softened or explained away or lost in the more romantic parts of his story. He was, in this, a man of his class, and his decade as much as a man of his own dark temper, though that is an explanation and never an excuse. In the 1930s, a strand of the British aristocracy looked across at Germany and saw not a gathering horror, but a bulwark against communism and a partner Britain might do business with, a regime to be appeased rather than resisted. There were dukes and lords and men of great name in those circles, drawn by a mixture of fear of another war, contempt for the politics of the left, and in some cases, an ugly sympathy with the new order's hatreds. Bendor moved among them and shared their views, and carried besides a personal anti-Semitism that the record does not let us pretend away. The charming young Duke of the Edwardian summer had become, by his later years, a man on the wrong side of the age, one of those grand and comfortable figures who could not see, or would not see, what was coming and what it would mean. None of that belongs to the story of the marriages, and it should not be allowed to bleed into it or to soften it by association. A man can fail at fatherhood and fail at decency both, and the two failures are separate, and each stands on its own. But the darkening politics and the darkening private man ran side by side through the same lonely years, the same restless circuit of houses, the same slow curdling of a nature that had once been all careless charm. He had been refused by the one woman he wanted, and had made a miserable marriage on the rebound, and had never, through any of it, got the son his whole life was arranged around. And somewhere in that long accumulation of disappointment, the golden young man had become someone smaller and harder and worse. The wealth stayed. The charm did not. And the hollow at the centre stayed exactly where it had always been. The same restless, certain, never refused man who had once charmed all of Europe spent the years of Europe's greatest crisis on the wrong side of the century's greatest moral question. And there is no version of his life that can be told truthfully without saying so plainly. It should stand at its true weight, and no more than its true weight, because it is a separate failing from the story of the marriages and the missing heir, and it must not be allowed to swallow them or, worse, to excuse them. Plenty of childless men did not become friends to fascism. Plenty of grieving fathers did not drift toward Hitler. The darkness in Bendor's politics was his own, made by his own character and his own choices, and it belongs in the account as his own responsibility, not as some inevitable product of a sad and disappointed life. What can fairly be said is that the same qualities that ran through the whole of him, the certainty, the impatience, the deep, unexamined conviction that the world should be arranged to his own liking, found in the ugly politics of the 1930s, an especially poisonous outlet, and that the man who could not bear to be refused anything proved equally unable to examine himself. Those who knew him in these later years described a man growing smaller inside his enormous fortune. The golden ease that had once made him the most charming presence in any room had hardened into suspicion and temper, and a kind of settled discontent. He had spent his youth as the centre of a glittering world, the sun around which the brightest people of the age arranged themselves, and he spent his middle and later age as a wealthy, lonely, difficult man, moving between Eton and the Scottish Lodge and the places in France with a restlessness that led nowhere and satisfied nothing. The marriages came and went. The wives arrived and withdrew. The friends fell silent, and underneath it, all the same hollow place stayed exactly where it had always been, at the dead centre of the fortune, shaped like a sun. For that was the wound that never healed, beneath the drink and the moods and the ugly politics. Through the whole of this long darkening, the estate stayed airless. Every year that passed was a year in which the sun had still not come, and Bendor was no longer a young man who could tell himself there was time. He was in his 50s now, and then approaching 60, and the boy the entail demanded had never been born to any of his marriages, and the one child of his body who might have carried the line lay under a stone at Eccleston these 20 and more years. The restlessness that drove him from house to house was, at bottom, the restlessness of a man who could not outrun that single fact. He had everything the world could offer, and none of the one thing his own name required, and no amount of moving or drinking or marrying had ever once closed the gap between what he owned and what he lacked. His third marriage was dead in all but law. His politics had carried him into disgrace among decent people. His friends had thinned to a handful. And still, incredibly, he had not finished marrying. There was one more wife to come, the fourth and the last, and she would be younger than the man's own daughters, a woman born after his children were born, and she too, in the end, like all the others, would give him no son. The long darkening of Bendor Grosvenor had one more strange chapter left to run, one last throw of the dice against the entail, and it would end, as everything in his life ended, in the same empty place where it had always been heading. Chapter 12. A bride younger than his daughters. In the end, he married a fourth time to a woman born after his own children were born, and even that last union gave the estate no son. The third marriage had to be formally ended first, and in 1947 the long-dead union with Loelia was at last dissolved by divorce, 17 years after that glittering wedding of the season. And in the very same year, on the 7th of February 1947, the Duke of Westminster, now 67 years old, married again. His fourth and final wife was Anne Winifred Sullivan, known to those close to her as Nancy, and she was 31 years old. The arithmetic of that marriage is worth sitting with for a moment, because it says almost everything that needs saying. Bendor was 67. His bride was 31. The gap between them was 36 years, which is to say she was young enough to be his granddaughter, and more startling still, She was younger than his own surviving children. His daughter Ursula had been born in 1902 and his daughter Mary in 1910, which made both of them older than the woman their father was now taking as his wife and duchess. A man who had buried an heir nearly 40 years before was marrying, at the very end of his long life, a woman born into a different generation from his own children, a woman younger than the daughters who had grown up in his houses. It is the portrait of a man still, after everything, after all the losses and all the failures, reaching for the thing the estate had always demanded, still hoping against every scrap of evidence that a young enough wife might yet produce the son that 4 decades of marriages had entirely failed to make. Look at the arithmetic once more, because it is almost too stark to believe. When Bendor married Anne, his elder daughter Ursula was 44 years old, and his younger daughter Mary was 36, and his bride was 31. He was marrying a woman 5 years younger than his own youngest child, a woman who might have been his granddaughter, and he was doing it in his 68th year, an old man by the standards of his time. There is a kind of terrible hope in that, and a kind of terrible refusal to accept the obvious. Any clear-eyed observer could see that the thing he was reaching for was almost certainly beyond him now, that a man of 67 marrying for the 4th time was not likely to be handed the son that youth and health and 3 earlier marriages had all failed to give him. He reached anyway. He had never in his life learned to accept a closed door, and he would not learn it now. Anne, for her part, took on a great deal in marrying him. She was a young woman from an Irish military family, fond of horses and the outdoor life, and she married a difficult, aging, immensely rich man near the end of a long and complicated story. A man twice divorced and once bereaved and darkened by his politics and his drink. What drew them together, the record does not say, and she left no account of it, guarding her privacy then and across the long life that came after. Whatever it was, it produced no child, and so the last marriage joined the other 3 in the same silence. The young wife gave the old Duke companionship for his final years, and she gave him no son, and the great question of his life stayed exactly as open on his wedding day in 1947 as it had been on the morning the first boy died. Anne herself came from far outside the world of Eton and the London ground rents. She had been born in April of 1915 at Glanmire, in County Cork, in Ireland, the daughter of a brigadier general, and she had brothers, one of whom, Adam, was killed in the fighting in Norway in 1940 during the war. She was young, and she was, by all accounts, a fine and spirited woman with a great love of horses and the country, and she married a man who was near the end of a long and complicated and increasingly lonely life. Already twice divorced and once bereaved of a dead son, already darkened by drink and disappointment, and worse. What exactly she made of the marriage, the record does not much say, for she left no memoir, as Loelia did, to tell the inside of it, and she guarded her privacy across the long life that followed. What can be said is that she took on a difficult, aging, immensely rich husband at the very close of his story, and gave him companionship in his final years. What the record does say, plainly and without exception, is the one thing that matters most to this story. The 4th marriage, like the 3rd, and like the 2nd before it, produced no children. There was no son. There was no heir. The young wife could not, give the aging Duke the boy the entail had demanded of him since the day he inherited it as a young man of 20. And so the last throw of the dice came up empty, exactly as every throw before. It had come up empty since the small coffin left the nursery at Eton in 1909. 4 wives. 4 marriages spread across nearly half a century of his life. And at the end of all of them, exactly one child who could have carried the line, dead at 4 years old, and no other son anywhere in the world. Set the 4 marriages side by side, and the pattern is complete and merciless. The first had given him a son, and then taken the boy away, and ended in the largest divorce England had ever seen. The second had given him nothing at all, and ended quietly after 6 empty years. The third had given him nothing but a great deal of misery, and ended in a long separation and a late divorce. The fourth, made to a woman younger than his own daughters, gave him nothing, and would end only with his death. He had done the thing he did with everything he had ever wanted. He had acquired, and acquired, and acquired 4 wives, one after another, the way he had acquired houses and yachts and paintings and estates. And the one possession he most needed, the living son the whole enterprise had been for, had refused through all of it to be acquired by any means at all. There is something almost unbearable in that final marriage when it is seen clearly for what it was. Here was a man of 67, one of the richest human beings alive on the earth, who could buy any comfort or pleasure the world contained, and who was still, at that late hour, arranging his life around a hope that should long since have died, the hope of a son and an heir of his own body. He had spent 40 years and 4 weddings on that hope. He had loved a woman who would not marry him, and married 3 women who could not give him a boy. And now, at the very end, with a young wife at his side, and the whole vast fortune still intact and glittering around him, he was as far from an heir of his own blood as he had been on the February morning the first and only one died. The last door had closed, though he may never have quite let himself see it close. There would be no 5th marriage, no further throw of the dice, no more young wives to hope for a son from. Anne would be his wife for the last 6 years of his life, and there would be no child. And the great question that had ruled his whole existence from the age of 20, who will inherit all of this, would be answered at the last not by a son of his body, not by love or by will or by all the wealth in England, but by the cold, blind machinery of the entail, reaching past him to a cousin he had never once meant to have it. Bendor had run out of wives and out of years, and the estate was about to collect, in full, on the one debt he had never in half a century been able to pay. Chapter 13. A record, even in death. When he died at last on a Scottish moor in the summer of 1953, the tacksman came for his estate on a scale that had never been seen before in England. Hugh Grosvenor, 2nd Duke of Westminster, the boy named after a racehorse, the richest man in Britain, died on the 19th of July, 1953, at Lochmore, his shooting lodge in the deer country of Sutherland, in the far north of Scotland. His heart gave out, a coronary thrombosis, quick and final. He was 74 years old. He died as he had lived, surrounded by his own vast acres, with a wife at his side, the 4th, and no son anywhere in the world to mourn him as an heir, or to take up the name behind him. There is a bleak fitness in where and how it happened. He died not in a London mansion or the great state rooms of Eton, but in a shooting lodge on a remote Scottish moor, in the deer forest that had been one of his favourite retreats, a place of guns and dogs and long grey days on the hill. It was, in its way, the most honest setting his life could have chosen for its end. A rich man's playground at the far edge of his empire, beautiful and cold and empty of everything but sport. The boy who had inherited half of London ended his days in the far north, among the deer, an old man whose heart simply stopped one July day. And the friend of his whole long life, Winston Churchill, the young officer he had met on the veldt more than half a century before, outlived him, still at the centre of the nation's affairs, a reminder of how far back Bendor's story reached, and how much of the world had turned while he chased the one thing it would not give him. He left behind him a great deal, in the crude accounting of possessions. He left the estates and the houses and the paintings, the London ground and the Scottish forests and the places in France. He left a widow of 38 and 2 daughters in middle age. He left, most of all, a question, the same question that had opened on a February morning 44 years before and had never once been answered in all the years between. And now it fell to be settled without him, by lawyers and by the cold rule of the succession, in favour of a man he had never meant to have any of it. He had outlived so much by then. He had outlived his only son by more than 40 years. He had outlived his friendship with the century, ending on the wrong side of its great war while his old companion Churchill led the nation through it. He had outlived 3 of his 4 marriages, and the youth and the golden charm that had made the first half of his life so bright. And now, on a moor in the far north, in the deer forest he had hunted all his life, the long, restless motion that had carried him from house to house and wife to wife finally stopped, and the fortune he had spent 74 years holding passed out of his hands at last, to be counted and taxed and divided by the machinery of the state and the ancient machinery of the entail. Even in dying he set a record, because the fortune was so enormous that the state's share of it alone was a sum without precedent in the country's history. The death duties levied on his estate came to around £18 million, an almost unimaginable figure for the time, the largest such bill the country had yet seen fall on a single estate. It was so vast that the family could not simply pay it out of hand. The settling of it stretched on for 11 years, the final instalment handed over to the revenue in 1964, more than a decade after Bendor was in his grave. That 11-year reckoning was part of a larger story, one that was closing over the whole of his class in exactly those years. Death duties had been rising for decades, and by the middle of the century they had become the great solvent of the aristocratic world, the force that broke up the estates that centuries of careful entailing had built. All across Britain, the grand families were meeting the same bill, and meeting it by selling, the paintings going to auction, the townhouses sold off, the great country seats handed to the nation or pulled down when no one could afford to keep them standing. The world of the enormous private estate, the world Bendor had been born at the very summit of, was dying around him even as he lived in it, taxed slowly out of existence one death at a time. His own record duty was simply the largest single instance of a thing that was happening everywhere, the state reclaiming, in the end, a share of the fortunes that private families had held for so long. The Grosvenor estate was rich enough and old enough and clever enough in its arrangements to survive the blow and go on, where many lesser families did not. The rent of central London was a deep enough well to pay even a bill of £18 million across 11 years and still remain one of the great fortunes of the country. But the very size of the duty is a measure of how the age had turned. A fortune that had arrived for centuries as an effortless river of rent now had to give up an unimaginable sum at its holder's death. And the giving up took more than a decade. Even the richest estate in Britain felt the weight of the new world pressing down, and Bendor, who had lived his whole life as though the old order would last forever, died just as the tax collectors were proving, in the largest possible figures, that it would not. The rent of Mayfair and Belgravia went on flowing in, and out of it, year by patient year, the estate paid down the record duty owed on the death of the man who had held it all. There is a bleak symmetry in that long repayment. All his life the fortune had arrived without effort, the rent flowing in whether he woke or slept, whether he was kind or cruel, a river with no source he had to tend. And now, in death, the fortune flowed out again on the same enormous scale, the largest duty ever recorded, draining away across 11 years toward the treasury. The wealth had been a river all his life, and it was a river still, only now it ran the other way. Even his death, like his divorces and his gifts and his houses and his yachts, became one more occasion for the world to measure the sheer size of what he had held, the biggest settlement, the biggest duty, the numbers always straining past anything ordinary people could picture. He had lived at a scale that made a mockery of ordinary measurement, and he died at that same scale, his passing itself a record. But the money, in the end, was never the true measure of the man, and the record-breaking duty is not the thing that makes his death a tragedy rather than merely a milestone. Fortunes are taxed, and estates pay their duties, and the great houses go on regardless. What makes his death the quiet closing of a long sorrow is the thing the duty could not touch and the thing the fortune could never buy, the empty place at the very centre of it, the missing son. When the accountants had finished their sums and the £18 million had begun its slow 11-year journey to the revenue, there remained the one question that had ruled Bendor's whole life and that no sum of money could answer or soften. Who would inherit the title? Who would carry the name? Who would take the dukedom of Westminster now that the second duke was dead, with no son of his body to follow him into it? He had married 4 times to be able to answer that question with a boy of his own blood, and he had failed at it 4 times over. And now death had made the failure final and irreversible. There would be no more marriages, no more chances, no more young wives to hope for a son from. The account was closed for good. The heir had never come in 40 years of trying. And so the great question fell, at the very last, to be answered not by love or by will or by all the wealth in England, but by the cold, blind rule of the entail, reaching past the dead man to find the nearest male body it could pass the whole vast inheritance to. That answer, when it came, is the final irony of the story, the thing the whole long tale of the 4 marriages has been travelling toward, and it is where it arrives at its quiet, merciless end. Chapter 14. The title that jumped the tracks. With no surviving son of his body, the dukedom that Bendor had married 4 times to keep in his own blood slid sideways at his death, and passed to a cousin. This is the ending the whole story has been moving toward since the first chapter, the moment the entail collected in full the debt that had gone unpaid for 50 years. The estate had always been bound to descend down a strict male line, father to son to grandson, and never otherwise. Bendor had made 1 son, and that son had died at 4, and no other had ever been born to any of his 4 marriages. So when he died, the line of succession did exactly what such lines were built to do. It looked past the dead man's 2 living daughters, who could inherit nothing under the entail, and it looked past the dead man himself, and it found the next male heir standing quietly in the wings, a cousin named William Grosvenor, and it handed him everything. William Grosvenor became the 3rd Duke of Westminster. The title, the entailed estate, the great inheritance that Bendor had spent his whole life trying to pass to a son of his own, went to a man who was not his son, not his grandson, not of his direct line at all, but a relative from a side branch of the family who happened to stand next in the male succession when the moment came. Everything the 4 marriages had been for, everything the record divorce and the long unhappy unions and the young final wife had been meant to secure, was undone in a single legal instant at the reading of the succession. The fortune found its heir, as it was always going to. It simply did not find him in Bendor's nursery, because Bendor's nursery had stood empty for more than 40 years. Think for a moment of what that sideways step erased. The whole point of an entail, The whole point of the anxious dynastic striving that had shaped and darkened Bendor's life was to keep the great inheritance running down through a man's own children, father to son to grandson, the blood and the fortune travelling together through the generations in an unbroken line. Bendor's blood did not travel with the fortune. His fortune rolled on, intact and enormous, into the hands of a cousin and his own direct line. The line he had married and married and married and married to continue simply stopped with him. It ended where he ended. The second Duke had 2 living daughters and a great many acres, and no way in the world to connect the one to the other, because the very law he lived under, the law that had made the son so desperately necessary, would not let a daughter carry the name or hold the ground. The daughters deserve a closer look here, because their position is the whole cruelty of the entail made personal. Ursula and Mary were Bendor's own children, of his own blood, alive and grown at his death. They had known him all their lives, and under the rule that governed the great estate, they might as well, for the purposes of the succession, never have existed at all. The title could not come to them. The entailed lands could not come to them. A cousin they may barely have known stepped past them to take the dukedom and the heart of the fortune, and the law did not so much as pause over the fact that the dead man had living children of his own, because those children were daughters, and daughters, in that iron system, did not count. What could be left to them privately was left, and it was not nothing. His 4th wife, Anne, would come to hold, alongside his daughter Lady Mary, some 120,000 Scottish acres that lay outside the strict entail. But the name, the title, the great inheritance at the centre of it all, passed clean over his own daughters to a man of the male line, exactly as the rule required. That is the machine working precisely as it was built to work, and it is a chilling thing to watch. The entail was never designed to be kind or fair or responsive to the shape of an actual family. It was designed to keep a great fortune whole and moving down a male line, and it did that with perfect indifference to everything else, to grief, to love, to the living daughters standing in the churchyard, to the 40 years their father had spent trying to feed it a son. When the son did not come, the machine did not mourn or hesitate. It selected the nearest male body and moved the whole inheritance into it. And Bendor's own line, his own blood, his own 2 daughters, were simply left to one side, outside the great current of the fortune, as it rolled on past them to a cousin and away into the future. And so the small grave at Eccleston takes on its final and heaviest meaning. Edward, Earl Grosvenor, dead at 4 years old in 1909, turned out to be not merely the first heir Bendor lost, but the last direct heir he would ever have. Everything that came after, all 4 decades of it, all 4 marriages and the great refusal in between, was an attempt to replace that one small boy, and none of it worked. And so the child under the stone remained, to the very end and beyond it, the only son the 2nd Duke of Westminster would ever make. The nursery that had emptied on a February morning stayed empty for the whole of his father's remaining life, and when that life ended, the title simply stepped over the empty nursery and went to a cousin, exactly as it would have done if Bendor had never fathered a son at all, exactly as though the boy had never lived. There is a terrible economy in it, when the whole long story is laid out flat and reduced to its bones. A man inherits the greatest fortune in Britain, bound by law to pass down his own male line. He makes one son, and the son dies. He spends the next 40 years and 4 marriages trying to make another, and fails at every turn. He dies, and the fortune passes to a cousin. Told that baldly, stripped of all its wealth and drama, it is the story of an enormous striving that changed nothing at all. a life spent pushing with all one's strength against a single closed door that never once gave way. All the wealth in England could not buy the boy the estate required, and in the end, the estate, entirely indifferent to how hard he had tried, simply took the nearest heir it could find and rolled on without him. The Grosvenor fortune, it should be said, remains to this day one of the great private landholdings in Britain, and the Dukedom of Westminster continues still, carried down the years from that cousin who inherited it when Bendor died. The rent of Mayfair and Belgravia still flows, as it has for centuries. The name still stands among the grandest in the country, but it flows, and it stands along a line that stepped around Bendor rather than through him, down from the cousin who received what the second Duke could never pass to a son. The estate got its future and its long continuation. Bendor did not get to be the road it travelled. His whole direct line narrows at the end to 2 daughters and a small carved stone in a Cheshire churchyard, while the fortune he had loved and served and feared for rolled on without him into hands he had never once meant it for. Chapter 15. The Women Who Outlived Him. Of the 4 women he married in his long chase after an heir, 3 outlived him, and every one of them proved to have a full and separate life that the second Duke of Westminster was only ever one chapter of. This is the necessary corrective to the whole cold frame of the story, and it must not be left out, because it is easy, telling a tale about a man's need for a son, to let the wives shrink into instruments of that need, as if they existed only to succeed or fail at giving him a boy. They did not exist for that. Each of them was a person in her own right, with a life that ran on long after Bendor's had stopped, and the shape of those lives is worth setting down carefully, because it is the truest answer to the cruelty at the centre of this story. Sheila, the first wife, the one who had given him the son and then been blamed for the boy's death, lived the longest of all of them. She had run a military hospital through the whole of the Great War and been decorated by her country for it, and after the record-breaking divorce, she made another life entirely, remarrying within weeks of the decree, and going on, cordial in the end, even with the man who had cast her off, to see her 2 daughters launched into society at balls she and Bendor hosted together. She lived until 1970, dying at the great age of 92, more than half a century after the child died at Eton, more than 50 years after the divorce, and 17 years after Bendor himself was in his grave. The woman he had married first and blamed most and paid off most grandly outlasted him by a full generation and carried her own honours and her own long life entirely independent of his. Violet, the second wife, the faint one, the marriage the story hurries past, did not linger in the wreckage of it either. Within a year of her divorce from Bendor, she had married again, her 3rd husband a naval officer, and she passed clean out of the Grosvenor story into a long life of her own that had nothing further to do with dukes or entails or the anxious business of heirs. She died in 1983. She had been 3 times a wife, and once, briefly and childlessly, a Duchess of Westminster in the middle of it all. And the dukedom that had loomed so enormous over Bendor's whole existence was, in the shape of her life, no more than a passing episode between 2 other marriages, a title she wore for 6 years and then set down. Loelia, the 3rd wife, the witness to the unadulterated hell, made perhaps the fullest second life of them all. After the long-dead marriage was finally dissolved in 1947, she went on for decades more, and in 1969 she married again, becoming the wife of the explorer Sir Martin Lindsay. She wrote her memoir, The Grace and Favour That Preserved Forever the Inside of Those Unhappy Years, and she became a figure in society and in letters in her own right, remembered as much for her book as for the coronet she had worn so uncomfortably and for so long. She lived until 1993, more than 60 years after that glittering wedding of the season, and 40 years after the death of the man whose moods and whose restlessness had once ruled the ceaseless circuit of houses she had been trapped inside. The wife who had suffered the worst of the marriages walked away from it into a long and full old age, and Anne, the fourth and last wife, the young bride who had been born after his own daughters, was widowed at the age of 38 when Bendor died in 1953, and she went on to live another half-century entirely without him. She retired to a house on the Eton estate and stayed there for 50 years, and she became a celebrated figure in the world of horse racing, the owner in time of the great steeplechaser Arkle, one of the most beloved and famous racehorses in the entire history of the sport. She died in 2003, 50 years a widow, remembered in her own right for the horses she owned and loved, rather than merely as the last of the wives of a difficult and aging duke. The young woman he had married at the very close of his life, in one last hope of a son, outlasted him by half a century, and made of that half-century something wholly and unmistakably her own. The two daughters, too, lived on beyond him. The children the entail had brushed aside. Ursula, the elder, born in the first years of the marriage that had begun it all, lived until 1978. Mary, the younger, born in the shadow of her brother's death, grew into a spirited woman with a passion for fast cars and the racing life, and she lived until the year 2000, dying at the very edge of a new century, 90 years after she was born into the old one. They had watched, as children and then as grown women, the long procession of their fathers' marriages, the stepmothers younger than themselves, the endless, restless search for the son who would displace them from nothing, since they had never stood to inherit the title in the first place. And they outlasted all of it, the marriages and the search and the man himself, carrying into their own long lives whatever the great machine of the entail had been willing to leave to a daughter. Gather the whole company of them together, then, the 4 wives and the 2 daughters, and the shape of the story shifts one final time. 6 women stood in the orbit of the second Duke of Westminster across his life, and every one of them, in her own way, outlived the thing he cared about most, the anxious dynastic hope that had ruled him from the age of 20. The wives walked out of their marriages into full lives of their own. The daughters, barred from the succession by the accident of their sex, lived long and well regardless. It was the man himself, and the fixed idea at the centre of him, that came to nothing. The women lived. The line did not. Set the 4 of them together, and the whole frame of the story quietly inverts itself. This is not, in the end, only the tale of a man who failed to get a son from 4 wives. It is also, just as truly, the tale of 4 women who married into the largest fortune in Britain, and each, in her own way, walked out the other side with a life that belonged entirely to herself. Sheila had her war and her honours and her long old age. Violet had her 3 marriages and her quiet freedom. Loelia had her book and her second husband and her lasting place in the record. Anne had her 50 years and her racehorses and her legend on the turf. The son that the second Duke of Westminster wanted so badly and married so many times to get, none of them gave him, and the failing was the dukedoms and the entails and the cold laws that made a son so necessary, and it was never in any true or fair sense theirs. They were not vessels that failed to deliver a cargo. They were women who lived and loved and outlived, and carried away from the marriage a great deal more than the marriage had ever given them, which leaves, at the very last, only the man himself, and the small carved stone at Eccleston, and the single hard truth that the whole long story has been circling from the first frame to this one. Chapter 16. The one thing the money could not make. He could buy a castle of 54 bedrooms, 2 ocean-going yachts, a hunting forest in France, and a parcel of the Riviera for a woman who would not marry him. And he could not buy, or marry, or inherit his way to the single thing his own title demanded of him, which was a living son. That is the whole story, compressed into one hard fact. The second Duke of Westminster commanded a fortune that could purchase very nearly anything the world contained, and he spent the length of his life learning, slowly and at enormous cost, that the things worth the most are precisely the things that lie forever outside the reach of money. An entail, stripped of all its old and stately language, is a machine for making sons. It exists for one purpose only, to drive a great fortune down through a man's male line, generation after generation, and it demands of each holder, in turn, the one contribution the fortune itself cannot supply, an heir of his own body. Bendor's machine failed. He fed it 4 marriages across nearly half a century, 4 weddings and 4 wives, and a great refusal in between, and it gave back to him nothing but a single small coffin and a title that jumped the tracks at his death. He could make the rent flow, and the houses rise, and the record divorces settle, and the young last wife say yes at the altar. And he could not make the one thing the whole vast apparatus had been built from the beginning to produce. A son could not be bought. Time could not be bought. And a healthy boy who lived to inherit was, it turned out, the one possession the richest man in Britain could never secure by any means, however many times he married in the trying. Set the 2 halves of his life against each other, and the lesson stands out in hard relief. On the one side, everything money could buy, and he bought all of it, houses and yachts and hunting forests, paintings and pearls, and a villa on the Riviera, a record divorce, and a young last wife, the whole glittering inventory of a fortune with no edges. On the other side, the short list of things money could not buy, and he was denied every one of them. A woman who would love him enough to marry him, a marriage that brought him peace, and above all, a son who would live to carry his name. He spent a lifetime and a fortune learning where the line between those 2 lists fell, and the learning cost him more than any of the things on the first list had ever cost, because the things on the second list were the only ones that had ever truly mattered. There is a hard justice in it, though it is a justice without mercy. A man raised to believe the world would always give him what he wanted was made, in the one matter he cared about most, to want and never receive. The rent had taught him that having and wanting were the same. The empty nursery taught him, across 40 patient years, that they were not. And the lesson arrived too slowly and too late to change anything, only in time to be understood. He died having grasped at last the one truth his whole gilded life had conspired to hide from him, that there are things no fortune on earth can command, and that the wanting of them, however fierce, however rich the man who wants, does not oblige them to come. There is a temptation to make Coco Chanel the key to all of it, to say that the woman who refused him broke something in him that never mended afterward. That would be too simple, and unfair to her and to him both. The drink and the moods and the ugly politics and the failed marriages were Bendor's own, made by his own character and his own choices, not caused by any one woman's no. Chanel was one refusal among the many the story holds. The woman he wanted, who would not be had, standing in the same long line as the son he wanted, who could not be kept. What she understood, and what he never quite did, was that some things answer to the will and the purse, and some things simply do not, and that a life arranged entirely around the getting of things is a poor preparation indeed for the 2 or 3 things in it that cannot be got at any price. That is the shape of his whole existence, seen clearly from the far end of it. He had been handed, at the age of 20, a world with no edges, a fortune that answered every want almost before he had finished feeling it, and it taught him the deep and dangerous lesson that wanting a thing and having it were the same single act. Most of his life confirmed the lesson handsomely. He wanted houses and had them, wanted yachts and had them, wanted wives and married them one after another. And underneath all of it ran the single want that the lesson could never satisfy. The want that had opened on a February morning in 1909 and never once closed again. And no amount of getting the other things ever came close to filling it. He died the richest of men and the poorest in the one currency his title actually required of him, and the two facts sat side by side in him, unreconciled, to the very end. So return, at the last, to where the story began. To the churchyard at Eccleston, a short walk from the gates of the great house, where a small stone memorial stands over the grave of a boy who died at 4 years old. His father commissioned it in the first raw year of his grief and set the finest hands he could hire to design and carve it. And it has stood there now for more than a century, on ground within sight of the palace the boy would one day have inherited. Around it, the whole Grosvenor fortune rolled on, into the hands of a cousin, and down the years to dukes who came after, the rent still flowing, the name still grand, the estate still one of the greatest in the land. But the child under the stone never moved from where his father laid him, and he never stopped being what he had been from the moment he died, the only son the second Duke of Westminster would ever have, the last direct heir of the richest man in Britain, the answer to a question that 4 marriages and half a century and all the wealth in England were never afterward able to ask again and have answered. He had everything, and he could not keep the one thing that mattered above all the rest. He married 4 times and buried the single child who could have carried his name, and left his title to a cousin and his son to a grave in a country churchyard. The fortune found its heir in the end, as great fortunes always do. It simply never once found him in the place his father had spent a whole long life looking, in a nursery at Eton Hall that emptied one February morning and stayed empty for the rest of his days. The richest man in Britain could buy anything the world had for sale, and there was almost nothing the world would not sell him. He went to his own grave at Eccleston, close by the small stone he had raised, having learned the one lesson his fortune had spared him all his life until the end, that the thing he wanted most had never for a single moment been for sale at all. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, because the next one is already being written and you will not want to miss it. And tell me below, of his 4 wives and the son he lost, which of them do you think he mourned the longest? Tell me where you are watching from, and what you would have done in his place. I read every reply,